was purchased from owners from the city who are brazen and hold no respect for the well-being of their new neighbors. They have disrupted the quality of life of our local residents and tell residents no truth. You may or may not be aware that this facility has been already shut down once for illegally growing cannabis without licenses to the tune of 5,000 plants, equaling $3.9 million of marijuana in June of 2017. There is not a moment in the day that cannabis is not controlling our thoughts or energies. The obnoxious odor that takes your breath away, that you can taste on your lips, that burns your eyes, that penetrates your homes, that makes you ill, that gives you sleepless nights, and that can even make you vacate your home is totally unacceptable.
Whatever you may call it, cannabis, weed, marijuana, it's been legal for recreational use since October 2018. But when you look back at cannabis history, weed has been legally passed around for close to 2 decades now. The following information comes from leafly.com. Medical marijuana has been available to Canadians since July 2001 with the Marijuana Medical Access Regulations, MMAR. This allowed Canadians to get prescriptions from their doctors and order medicinal prescriptions from licensed producers or grow their own at home. In July 2013, the government changed directions with legislation and introduced the Marijuana for Medical Purposes Regulations, MMPR. Different portions of the law rolled out over the following 2 years after this legislation was put in place. MMPR made it so patients could only get their cannabis from government licensed producers, a bit of an inconvenience to those who truly needed it. 3 years later, in 2016, Neil Allard challenged the MMPR legislation for suspending personal production licenses from patients. The Federal Court of Canada ruled in Allard's favor and revised the laws again with the Access to Cannabis for Medical Purposes Regulations, ACMPR. Under these new regulations put into effect August 24, 2016, authorized patients would be able to grow a specific number of plants based on their prescriptions and whether they would grow outdoors or indoors. The issue with this new legislation is that they were only given 6 months to put it through after suspending the MMPR, which some have said it was quite rushed. And with this, there's an issue with these grow ops across rural Ontario and places like Norfolk County, and even other provinces like Quebec, Manitoba, and British Columbia. And the biggest issue of it all, well, it really stinks. According to the Saskatoon Star Phoenix, in 2018, Saskatoon doctor Meshach Zuwain was charged with improperly prescribing cannabis. The doctor allegedly issued prescriptions without doing proper assessments and excessively billed for it also. The same doctor this February was fined $15,000 and also has to pay $8,700 to cover the cost of the hearing and the investigation. Zuwain had prescribed nearly 1,000 patients over the course of 6 weeks back in 2017. According to Statista.com, as of June 2019, the number of medical marijuana clients registered in Canada reached just over 364,000, a 1,520.75% increase since June of 2015, and it has steadily grown since then. These prescriptions given out to Canadians are a part of a growing problem affecting Canadians from the east to the west, and although the only case that could be found of overprescription was the doctor in Saskatoon, residents of Norfolk County like Debbie France are still concerned about overprescribing. In a beige-bricked home located on a rural road, France has lived in peace with her local community for her entire life. In this cozy home, you will find various plants, nature paintings, and a warm fireplace that really makes you feel like you're at home. It is where she raised her children, and now where she watches her grandchildren from time to time. Here's France, an advocate for safety and concerns of local residents living near cannabis grow-ops, referring to the grow-op down the road from her house in Norfolk County, where over 70 Part 2 producers are now located.
They are only growing for 4 prescriptions. So that's the medicine for 4 people. So it's hard to believe that this amount of cannabis could be consumed by any person in one day, and what their physical health would be, that they would need that much cannabis.
They shouldn't need it.
No.
I think.
The national average is 2 grams per day, as per statistics from Health Canada's website. These work out to be, at this site alone, works out to be about 69 to 70 grams a day. So that's 3,450% higher than the national average.
France also did some math, which you can see on the screen. There are 3 different scenarios in which each scenario shows a different crop yield amounts and how much money that could be made on the illicit markets as a result of it. These numbers will be noted below for the viewers to analyze for themselves. These medical marijuana sites are different from government-maintained facilities. Both types of sites sometimes are commonly referred to as either L1 or Part 1 and L2 or Part 2 producers. Here's Daphne Schuyler, a friend and fellow advocate of France's, explaining the difference between the 2 types of producers.
There's 2 different sections. Part 1 is the Part 1 license production. They first have to put money into putting up a purpose-built building to grow marijuana, have the proper filtration system. It gets inspected, and they have to do all that before they can get their license to grow. If they're done properly, there's no smell from those facilities. They hire local people to work. They put money into the community with the business, construction people. They are inspected on a regular basis, a monthly basis, and so we have no problems with them. The Part 2s are the unmonitored designated medicinal marijuana grows, however, are different. Doctors will write out a prescription. It gets taken to Health Canada, and according to what the doctor has prescribed, Health Canada decides how many plants they can grow.
Or to simplify it even further, and specifically Norfolk County, a Part 1 producer of cannabis is a government-regulated facility with proper air control, which emits no odors and has a 150-meter setback from residences. While an L2 or Part 2 producer is usually run out of a greenhouse for medical purposes. It usually has no air control or odor filtration and is supposed to have a 300-meter setback from residences. It also should only grow for 4 prescriptions. But that's not the case for many of these Part 2 producers in Norfolk County. The one near France is an old tomato greenhouse located at 681 Concession Road 14, Townsend in Simcoe, Ontario. The grow-up has been since shut down temporarily until a court agreement later this year is met. The backyard of this grow-up currently is littered with plastics, potting soil, and other items. It is almost as messy as a landfill, and the pond separating the property from the neighboring farm looks as cloudy as a watered-down glass of milk. France has been dealing with this issue for the last 3 years. Here's her family's story surrounding issues with the grow-up on their road.
Okay, my son and daughter-in-law purchased a home in September of 2016. They had massive renovations to do to the home. They did the renovations when we were busily helping them with this. In March of 2017, just before they were about to move into it, the house was, they could start to smell smells. And in March of 2017, the property changed hands and cannabis started to grow on the property. They complained to Norfolk County. At the same time, we saw additional 911 numbers being added to the property, and we're wondering what was happening with that. A, B, C, and D. And in cannabis at that site was being grown, and it was the smells were beginning to come evident. I was so naive that when I walked down the road, I smelled skunks, and my son, when I asked him about the smell, he said to me, "Mom, that's marijuana." I was that naive that I had no idea that that smell was coming from the marijuana. In June of 2017, the property was raided. The site was charged with producing illegally. They did not have any licenses to produce. Over 500 plants were seized and $3.9 million worth of product was taken by the police. At that time, they seized some vehicles and they seized some cash at the same time. Ironically, we thought our problem had disappeared, okay? It wasn't long thereafter that we saw they were producing again, but they were producing by means of generators. Norfolk Hydro had been out and had stopped their, cut off the hydro to their place because they were growing illegally. It was our assumption that in August they must have finally received their proper licenses because hydro was reconnected and the generators stopped.
So they were given legal medicinal licenses.
Yes.
Even after they had criminal, not convicted, but criminal offenses.
Yes, yes, they did.
A few years later, on a summer afternoon in August 2019, around 2 o'clock on a Sunday, Francis' grandson and other neighborhood children played outside within close proximity of the grow-up. They didn't even know to the full extent what was happening until police vehicles rolled up. This was something this small community had never seen in their lifetime. A robbery had taken place there.
Norfolk County OPP, just coming to you live from Concession 14 here in Townsend. Just wanted to bring you an update with regards to an ongoing investigation that I can talk to you about right now. I can tell you on Sunday, August 25th, just shortly around 2:30 in the afternoon, the Norfolk County OPP detachment responded to a report of a robbery at a Concession 14 address here in Townsend in Norfolk County. It was determined that several unknown suspects armed with handguns attended the address and gained entry into a cannabis farm. Once inside, one of the victims was assaulted and received minor injuries as a result. I can tell you that the suspects then removed a large quantity of marijuana and fled in a red-colored Ford F-150 pickup truck with a cap on the back of the box, with a U-Haul truck following. So we're asking anyone with information that may have seen something suspicious yesterday in and around that time, around 2 to 2:30, to give the Norfolk County OPP detachment a call at 1-888-310-1122, or if the risk may anonymous, you can contact Crime Stoppers and be eligible for a cash reward. The Norfolk County OPP Crime Unit is continuing to investigate and is seeking the public's assistance with this investigation. Please, if anyone has any information, they're being urged to contact the police immediately or Crime Stoppers to be eligible for a cash reward. So I'm Constable Ed Sanchuk. If I have any further details, I'll definitely bring you some updates. But right now, I can tell you that several armed individuals attended this address. As a result, one of the victims was assaulted, did receive minor injuries. The good news is not serious injuries. So again, we are searching for several suspects as a result of this incident. So I'm Constable Ed Sanchuk. Please make sure you take care, stay safe, and get home safe to your family tonight, folks. Take care.
It was a fear that we always had. We had witnessed a lot of activity there that we did not feel was kosher, okay? We had seen people at the front gate, you know, a little baggie come out and, you know, exchange, and away they went. One night my son and daughter-in-law witnessed at night, a car that had its trunk opened up, and it was obvious, like you couldn't be for sure, but your guesses would be what was going into that trunk. That's a fear that you have, especially when you have small children, okay? It was a concern of the whole neighborhood. They did put a fence up, okay, but they didn't put a fence up around the whole property, okay? It's still visible from the east side and back of the site.
France said the odors from the site caused many adverse effects on her and her family's livelihood. These include anxiety, sleep deprivation. Her daughter-in-law suffered migraines and tremors. Her grandchildren would cough and gag. Usually it was just cow manure France could smell around her property, which wasn't a huge deal, But until not too long ago, when the property was forced into prohibition, all she could smell was cannabis to the degree of 10,000 skunks. The odor would penetrate her son's home. They had new windows in the house. It wasn't an old home by any means. Even special carbon filters couldn't stop the smell from entering their home. On top of all that, there was more issues than just the odor.
Yep. Besides the odor, okay, the site lights up, and my son's lawn will look like a football stadium. The light is so bright. Mm-hmm. They have blackout curtains. The children's bedrooms are at the front of the house, so they have blackout curtains. I think they probably got 2 sets of curtains on the children's bedrooms. So that, the light doesn't bother. The light to them is not as big as a deal as the odor, okay? The property itself is not large enough to accept the large transport trucks that go to it. It's a safety concern on the road when they unload fertilizers, whatever. When they unload that on the concession road, there is a knoll in the road, and it's a fear that people coming along, these big trucks and stuff are on the. It's a transportation hazard. What's going on there? The site isn't big enough for them to navigate in, and these large transports have to round on my son's lawn to be able to get into the site when they do get in.
When it comes to adverse effects, there isn't enough research to prove that odors cause health issues, but it's evident by France's family that it does, according to Public Health Ontario, and I quote, "No studies on health effects associated with exposure to cannabis odors were identified in the scientific or grey literature. The perception of odor is not a reliable way to determine the risk of health effects." They go on to say in this document that in general, most substances responsible for odors in the outdoor air are not present at levels high enough that can cause long-term health effects. However, exposure to unpleasant odors may affect an individual's quality of life and sense of well-being. Exposure of odorous compounds can potentially trigger physical symptoms, depending on the type of substance responsible for the odor, the intensity of the odor, the frequency of the odor, the duration of the exposure, and the sensitivity of the individual detecting the odor. End quote. With all these problems, Debbie and her fellow advocates have spent long hours helping to address these issues in Norfolk County. In January, they held an information session at a local high school in Waterford, Ontario to share their findings with roughly 400 members of the community. As of January 12th, and according to the Simcoe Reformer, they have gotten 162 signed complaints submitted to the county. Now, it was originally just France who was primarily working on addressing this issue since 2017 when it first affected her. That was until fall of 2019, when Orville Slack and Daphne Schuyler, a couple from Waterford, joined the team as they were experiencing a similar issue of their own. Slack, 69, who has snowy white hair and a deep grizzly voice, is now retired. He's a former OPP officer with 38 years of experience. He now spends a good portion of his time working alongside his wife and France on informing Norfolk residents on the potential dangers and other issues surrounding Part 2 cannabis producers.
Right now, primarily becoming aware of what's happening in our community, became very concerned, felt that residents weren't aware of what was happening in the community, and thought that having spoken with Matt Vaughn, the principal planner, Daphne spoke to him, and I subsequently after that spoke to Deb, and she enlightened us as to what was happening even further. Felt that we had to get involved in a lot of different levels to help address the issue, help the community address the issue, but local politicians at the municipal level, provincial level, and federal level weren't acknowledging, and are still not acknowledging, that this is a major problem in our communities. Not just this community of Norfolk County, not just Waterford, but all across southwestern Ontario. It's a huge issue that no one's paying any attention to.
And it's even, I've read articles all across Canada. Too.
Yes.
Yeah, right?
Yes, exactly. It's just not Ontario. Quebec's got an issue. British Columbia's got another large issue surrounding cannabis cultivation, and it's a large problem. And when you mention that across Canada, that raises the first question, I guess, then, is why isn't it being addressed? Why isn't the concerns being raised in the House of Commons then? Why isn't it being raised by our federal MPs? No one's talking about it.
Their problem is locally in Waterford, Ontario at the Van Gotham farm on Old Highway 24. This grow up is roughly only 85 meters away from residences, but it's not grown all year round like the one by Francis.
Daphne probably mentioned there, it's a former tobacco farm. Had some what they call loop greenhouses. There's, I believe, 5, if not 6 of those greenhouses there. Obviously, at one point in time, would have been used to grow seedlings for your tobacco plants prior to them taken out and transplanted into the fields. Okay. They've been sitting there not being used, as I understand, for the last little while, and so the individual sees that as an opportunity to take advantage of the loopholes in the Cannabis Act, and he chooses then to fill his greenhouses full of marijuana. Because of the close proximity to the subdivision on the south end of Waterford, we get the effect being the smell of 10,000 skunks, as some people described it, and I think it's an adequate way to describe it. And recognize that it affects people differently. Myself, I may find that as an annoying smell and inconvenience, but you got to recognize that other people are impacted at a far greater extent than that. Some people in our community, they can't open their windows. Some people have to shut their air conditioners off. Some people can't open their windows. Some people can't go out and sit outside and enjoy the outside. They have to stay in their house when this smell of 10,000 skunks moves across and over the south end of Waterford, and sometimes pretty well engulfs a good portion of the town. And for what end? Somebody wants to make some money fast and easy and operate without the perimeters of the permit that was issued to him by Health Canada.
Now, it's important to note that not all these Part 2 producers are growing without a license. Many could be, as was the case originally for the one down the road from France. But it's the concern that these grow-ops are overgrowing outside of their allowed prescription or are simply being prescribed too much. The strong odors, of course, are another concern involved.
I think it's well known that the marijuana they're producing outside the perimeters of the licenses issued by Health Canada, it is feeding the illicit marijuana market or cannabis market, or call it what you will. It's black, gray. It's the illicit market.
Yeah.
And recognize that these Part 2s are known as unmonitored designated medical marijuana growers or facilities. That only applies when they're operating within the perimeters of the permit that's issued to them by Health Canada, based on the 4 prescriptions that they've been allowed to grow for. As soon as they operate outside of that perimeter, it's nothing more than an illegal grow-up. That's all it is. And so they're hiding behind these 4 licensed prescriptions, if you will, and as a result of that, the fact that they're not monitored, they feel very comfortable that they can fill a greenhouse and literally make millions off of it.
Slack also noted a case in Leamington, Ontario, where a medical marijuana grow facility was overproducing. You can see in this video the scale of the operation. According to Blackburn News, police seized 7,000 marijuana plants, 560 kilograms of cannabis, 23 kilograms of methamphetamine, over 1,500 ecstasy pills, 9 pounds of magic mushrooms, various weapons including a Tech 9 machine gun, a silencer, and $220,000 in cash. Constable Andy Pattenden for the York Regional Police said in response to this case that they're seeing in a lot of cases where it involves organized crime where they pool their medical licenses together to grow beyond the licensed amounts. Pattenden also noted that the scale of the cannabis at these sites was used to fund the manufacturing of chemical drugs. Going back to Slack, he said he's also concerned with what higher levels of government haven't done to address this issue.
I think it's disappointing at a lot of different levels when one stops and reflect on the changes that have to be made. There have to be changes made at the municipal level. Keeping in mind the municipal government only can do so much.
Yeah.
They're limited, they're bylaws, they're separation bylaws. Our local municipality is doing the best they can. I think there's other opportunities they could take advantage of. But having said that, like I say, they've dedicated one bylaw officer to the task of trying to address this issue. And like most municipalities, they're operating with limited resources. So probably, in the truth be known, they probably should have 2, maybe 3 people dedicated to this cause, this issue. Can't be done. But what is more disappointing is that currently we have a progressive conservative majority government at Queen's Park. We have locally a conservative MPP. If you look at the grid across southwestern Ontario as far as the electoral areas, starting probably in the Leamington area, you could go further, maybe closer to Sarnia, but if you started that in, right back, work your way back east to Hull of Norfolk, then continue east down to Niagara. Slip back up into York region. That's where some of these Asian gangs are coming from that are making the money from these endeavors. Also the Aurora area. If you take that area into consideration, there are 10 conservative MPPs. Out of that 10, there are 5 ministers that make up the majority conservative government. And to this date, this issue has never been raised in an open session at Queen's Park. And when we speak to our local conservative MP, he doesn't feel, he recognizes, by the way, he recognizes that the Food Production and Protection Act that's put in place to protect farmers, he recognizes that that act is providing cover or protection for these legal growths. But having recognized that that is providing cover for these individuals, to this date, he's never suggested or proposed even that the issue should be discussed in Queen's Park. There's been no suggestions to make changes in the legislation that would remove some of the protection from these individuals. Severe failing on the part of the current majority conservative government. They have an opportunity to make a positive impact on what is having such a negative impact on our communities, and they're not taking the initiative to do that. And I suggest that is a serious failing on their part.
So what should governments do at all levels about this issue? Spoke talked with Wayne Caldwell, a professor from the University of Guelph who specializes in rural planning and development, to dig deeper on this issue. While his expertise isn't too familiar with the issue of marijuana grow-up zoning, he does offer some interesting insights on what could be done at higher levels of government to help municipalities overcome this neglected issue. In terms of Norfolk County, or just in general with the cannabis industries, especially Part 2 producers and L2 producers,
Yeah.
how familiar with the zoning of Norfolk County in relation to that?
Yeah, not overly familiar with the specifics of what Norfolk is doing. I think, like lots of people, I'm in the process of learning exactly what are best practices and what can be done, and perhaps even what should be done in terms of regulating the sector, recognizing that the federal government has a role to play and the provincial government has a role to play, and certainly local municipalities have a role to play as well.
Yeah, that's one of my later questions, but we'll jump down to that then. When it comes to that, do you think that federal or provincial governments should get more involved with municipal governments and working together to these
Yeah.
regulations?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I think I would say that that the role for the federal government is in the licensing of facilities, as I would understand it. The land use planning side of things is a provincial responsibility primarily. So if we're dealing with land use planning, that would be a criteria that the province, if they chose to, would become involved with more so. And certainly there's an important role for municipalities because these impacts tend to occur at the local level. These impacts tend to vary by municipality. And if we want to see a greater level of coordination between those municipalities, then I would say that responsibility flows largely to the province. And we can think of a couple of examples of that over time. I have been quite involved in the intensification of the livestock sector over my career. And in particular, going back at more than one point in time in the 1980s and again in the early 2000s, there was lots of construction happening in the livestock sector. There were issues of beaches being posted in terms of water quality, people not being able to use, not being able to use the beaches associated with their cottages, for example, during the summer. And there was lots of attention drawn to larger facilities, significant concentrations of hogs or dairy for that matter, and the impact on water quality. And as a result of that, the province became involved and passed legislation known as the Nutrient Management Act. And that legislation set in place a set of criteria, meaning that if you were farming in Huron County or if you were farming in Lambton County, you were likely to see quite similar kinds of regulations between the two areas.
Okay.
And I mention that, I suppose, because there's some parallels with the cannabis sector in terms of we're getting into a situation where the rules in one county or one municipality are different than they are in the neighboring county and municipality. And that does two things. It has the potential to concentrate production in those areas where the regulations might be more minimal and push it out of areas where it's more restrictive. And the question is that the right kind of outcome that we should be aiming for, where one community might be prepared for it and another community isn't?
So basically what Caldwell is saying here is that there needs to be a group effort on the parts of the province and local municipalities to combat this issue. He then went on to talk about how we should or shouldn't define marijuana grow facilities in terms of being an agricultural, industrial, or commercial activity. Would you, I guess you kind of addressed this a little bit, but would you say there's an issue with how Part 2 or L2 marijuana grow ops are still considered as agricultural land use instead of commercial? Especially, I think this is generally just in Norfolk County or maybe other areas, but I know I'm more familiar with the zoning in Norfolk County now than I was before.
Yeah.
Do you think that's an issue for Norfolk County and how they zone their
cannabis? Yeah. I'm still coming to learn what this means, just as many people might be and within the planning profession. But my understanding of a Part 2 facility, and you might want to correct me if I haven't got this quite right, but my understanding of a Part 2 facility is those are the facilities that are connected to the production for medical purposes, correct?
Yeah.
Where people are identifying them. So I mean, I think there's a couple of fundamental questions. One of which is the production of cannabis an agricultural activity? Does it differ from tobacco or grapes or corn for that matter? And from my perspective, I would say generally it is an agricultural activity and can and should be treated as one. Now the question is, if we accept that premise, then the question is, what are the rules and regulations under which they should be established? And I'm aware of situations where people who aren't producing but happen to live close to these facilities are significantly disadvantaged in terms of, I've even heard of a story of folks having to move out of their homes as a result of it. So how widespread this is, I think is a function of getting a better handle of it from the point of view of research to look at it. And I would say that if again we accept it as an agricultural activity, then perhaps we need to deal with it differently though than what we've traditionally dealt with agricultural activities in terms of setting in place some standards and regulations, whether they be production occurring within greenhouse facilities or whether they be open air production.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you think can be done, in your opinion, to help with this issue at a municipal or provincial, federal level?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the real challenge is, as I understand it, have come to understand it, that uh, the, the, the facilities that have gone through thorough licensing by the federal government tend to be more acceptable at the community level. It's the facilities where conversions have happened from other activities, and the challenge in that is that if marijuana cannabis production is treated the same way as other crops traditionally are, then there's very little that can be done from a regulatory perspective. And it speaks to, I think, in some fashions, even though I believe it to be an agricultural crop in the same way that crops from a certain perspective, in the way that some other crops are considered, it doesn't mean it's the same. And that difference is something that I think we would benefit from having a better handle on what that difference is in terms of how we treat it relative to other kinds of crops. I really can't think of any other crops that we produce in Ontario that have the potential to be offensive in the way that I've come to understand that cannabis production is.
Do you think the government, any levels of government, are doing enough to in regards to this issue?
Yeah. I think there's opportunity for all levels of government to be more engaged, if I could put it that way. Again, it gets complicated by the legislation that exists. It gets complicated by our legal expectations between different levels of government. So I think on the part of municipalities, there's an opportunity to get a good sense of what other municipalities are doing. I think in the part of the province, there's an opportunity as well to get a handle on what would be appropriate standards. We use the Farming and Food Production Protection Act in Ontario to identify normal farm practices. What is normal farm practice as it relates to cannabis production? And there's an opportunity there to come forth with some clearer statements in terms of what that might look like as a means of helping to guide the industry. And to the degree that the federal government has an opportunity to be involved, recognizing that the legislative opportunities exist related to land use are primarily a provincial responsibility. To the degree that the federal government can be more engaged in the licensing of some of these facilities, would be a positive as well.
So it would be helpful if the provincial and federal governments got more involved, because when Spoke talked with Matt Vaughn, Norfolk County's former principal planner, he said that it's a challenge of enforcement in local municipalities and the lengthy processes of the provincial court systems that make it harder to enforce the issue. Do you know what's in store for the coming years for Norfolk County as you were leaving, or?
Yeah, so Norfolk County is still in this predicament where it has a fairly robust policy framework for cannabis production. The challenge lies in the enforcement side. So you can have the best policy in the world, but if nobody follows it, it's sort of dead in the water. So in order to have those policies be followed, they have to be enforced. And the enforcement side, unfortunately, in Ontario is quite a lengthy process. And it generally involves sort of a warning period and then several stages until you can actually get the use to finally discontinue. And those stages can take a year to 2 years in order to occur.
Spoke also asked him what Norfolk had previously been doing in the past years to address this issue. Vaughn went on to explain different regulations the county looked at and some that they're still working on implementing.
So back in late 2017, we recognized that there was a bit of a land use issue between some cannabis producers and surrounding neighbors. So we put together a cannabis task force that consisted of several different internal departments in Norfolk County, as well as the local OPP detachment, Health Canada, and a couple different branches of the province. So together, we came up with 3 options for regulating cannabis production. One of those was using like an odor bylaw, which would be regulated through the Municipal Act. Another was looking at implementing some sort of controls through our zoning bylaw. And then another was with business licensing. So The problem with business licensing is that these Part 2 facilities technically aren't supposed to be businesses. So that sort of rules out using that as a tool. An odor control bylaw probably would be effective if there was some time and science put into coming up with a separation and some consistency with a measurement tool. But we didn't really have the time for that. So we looked at implementing some controls through zoning regulations. Norfolk was lucky at the time. It had an existing provision in its zoning bylaw that spoke specifically to medical marijuana production facilities. This was something that was brought into the zoning bylaw back in, I want to say 2013, during the days of the MMPR, which was a response to the MMAR, so different regulations at Health Canada level. But basically, you have sort of a chain of events where the federal government was trying to regulate cannabis production. There was a federal case that led to the appeal to the Superior Court here in Canada. This resulted in the creation of the ACMPR, which then created two streams of production, both the medicinal side and then also the sort of commercial medicinal side. So you had people who could grow it for themselves, and then you had growers who could grow it for the medicinal side. That was later superseded by the Cannabis Act, but the remnants of the ACMPR are still exist in the Cannabis Act. So we today still have two streams of production. So Norfolk's bylaw looked at kind of grouping all forms of cannabis production into one use. So it doesn't distinguish between Part 1 or Part 2 type facilities. If it's cannabis production, which is defined in the zoning bylaw, then it's regulated. And if it's regulated, then it has to meet a series of criteria. Some of those criteria being separation distance requirements, and also the implementation of site plan control. So anyway, that gives you a little history of sort of how that came to be. And then later on, about early spring 2019, those provisions were amended again. And when they were amended again, they brought in some regulation in terms of light emissions, and then also created potentially a future for cannabis tourism in Norfolk County, which at the time was putting the cart a little bit before the horse, but we'll see where things end up. It's likely we'll see that some of these production facilities, namely the licensed ones, will be able to operate a retail store. So several of them are located in the ag area, so we'll see some on-farm diversification occur between the licensed facilities and potentially a retail store, and diversifying that farm use there.
Vaughn is currently studying at the University of Waterloo and is getting his doctorate in planning. He specifically is focusing on cannabis-related issues.
Yeah, of course. So right now, I'm continuing my studies at university right now, and my dissertation is specifically on cannabis land use planning, looking on of course the production side of things. Some of the regulation could occur at the provincial level. That's one of the areas that I'm studying now, looking at other forms of agriculture that are regulated by the province, such as livestock and the guidelines that exist for livestock. There may be some opportunity for OMAFRA, a branch of the Ontario government, to regulate cannabis production and create some sort of a setback framework similar to how they've done that with livestock. So I'm looking at various examples, MDS being one of them, and there are several other examples globally that several jurisdictions will use to regulate odorous type uses, odorous agricultural uses, and other odorous uses. So there's also D6 guidelines, which is something that the Ministry of Environment will look at, that'll help to regulate industrial uses. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that cannabis is industrial, but it definitely has some similarities. So we can definitely look at some of the other land use regulations that exist currently in Ontario and try to take some pieces of them to form a new type of regulation. And that's what I'm focusing on now in my studies.
With all that, there are many possible solutions the government should look at implementing. If OMAFRA, Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, steps in to help solve this issue by regulating cannabis production in the ways that we've seen with livestock, like Caldwell talked about, in places like Kern or Lambton counties, it could help substantially. There are also D6 guidelines, which are guidelines intended to be applied in the land use planning process to prevent or minimize future land use problems due to encroachment of sensitive land uses and industrial land uses on one another. There are also MDS guidelines, which are the minimum distance separation formula. They are land use planning tools that determine setback distances between livestock barns, manure storages, and anaerobic digesters, as well as surrounding land uses. The objective of MDS is to minimize land use conflicts and nuisance complaints related to odor. MDS does not account for other nuisances such as noise or dust. MDS is made up of two separate but related formulae that act reciprocally to cite both new development and new expanding livestock facilities. MDS 1 provides the minimum separation distance between proposed new development and any existing livestock barns, manure storages, and/or anaerobic digesters. MDS 2 provides the minimum distance separation between proposed new, expanding, or remodeled livestock barns, manure storages, and/or anaerobic digesters, and existing or approved development. With all this, there are some parallels from the agricultural industry to the cannabis industry, and if we take guidelines like this and adjust them or add on to them to help out municipalities with these issues, it can go a long way. Of course, this would take the help and concern from various levels of the provincial government and even the federal government to help regulate this issue, but so far it doesn't seem as though there is much being done besides at the municipal level and police stings like the one done in Leamington. The whole situation is like an older sibling telling their younger siblings to fend for themselves and fix an issue that wasn't started by them. It's not fair to municipalities and something needs to be done. Spoke would like to end this documentary by letting France tell viewers what she wants to see happen in regards to the grow up down the road from her home, what she wants to see governments do to combat this issue, and she even has a personal message for the government overseeing this issue.
I'm hoping that the site closes down permanently for cannabis production. And my biggest fear is that this limited company is shut down, but then will sell their property and will restart the whole process under a new corporation.
What do you hope will change in terms of how the government is dealing with this issue?
I hope all forms of government work together to recognize the loopholes that are being used to exploit the illicit market in designated grower locations and bring consistent regulations to all of Canada.
And would you like to leave some sort of message, or would you like to leave a message to provincial or federal governments and what you want them to do?
Please, governments, let us have our communities back so we can enjoy our homes and properties and not be held hostage and live in fear of these operations that are not following good production practices that encompass the health and safety of our residents and our families.